The term psychopath is often used to describe some of the most disturbing and cruel people in history. Someone with psychopathic traits might not be the dangerous individual you might imagine when hearing the phrase, and many go on to find success in business, politics, or other high-profile industries. But many of those from history, who psychologists have identified as having these traits, definitely line up closer to the pop culture idea of what a psychopath is. Number 10. Henry VIII is one of the most notorious monarchs in English history. Not only did he send 2 of his own wives to a gruesome end, but thousands of others faced a similar fate during his reign. Nobody was safe, with some of his closest friends becoming victims of Henry's paranoia. Historians and psychologists have debated whether Henry was actually a psychopath, or if he had some other mental condition that could explain his horrifying actions. Henry ruled England from 1509 to 1547, inheriting the throne from his father, Henry VII. During that time, he was married 6 times, went to war with France, separated England from the Catholic Church, and started a new church with himself at its head. According to historians, most of Henry's most notorious behavior came late in life. Henry's relationship with his first wife, Catherine, was seen as remarkably good for the time period. It wasn't until 1533 that they were divorced, and Henry remarried to Anne Boleyn. It was at this point that the traits Henry became notorious for started to shine through. While trying to arrange an annulment through the Catholic Church, some of the people who had once been Henry's closest allies began to feel his wrath. This included Cardinal Wolsey, one of Henry's oldest friends, who was charged with treason but passed away from natural causes before he could face the charges. Starting the Church of England had a dramatic effect on the entirety of the country. Monasteries were dissolved, relics and libraries were burned or destroyed, and thousands of people were dispossessed. Even those not directly connected to the monasteries would have been concerned. Many people would have seen their immortal souls as being on the line if religion were not done properly, and they would see Henry breaking from Rome as having consequences beyond their lifetime. It also meant a dramatic realignment in England's alliances, as Henry's war in France had initially been in defense of the Catholic Church. Despite no longer having that motivation, Henry continued to go to war with France, a costly endeavor to his subjects. At home, he continued to struggle to produce a male heir. Anne Boleyn was charged with treason and adultery. Ordinary people were tortured into giving confessions that would see the Queen convicted, and she eventually lost her head. The same fate would meet Henry's 5th wife, Catherine Howard, who was only 19 when she lost her life. It wasn't only violence and cruelty to people who'd once been close to Henry that made some psychologists believe he was a psychopath. Henry was also very charming, especially in his early life. He showed signs of grandiose behavior, even more than would be typical of a king at the time. He was named the supreme leader of the Church of England, and the Bible produced for use in that church saw Henry sitting in a grand chair at the top of the cover, handing out books to his followers. Overall, Henry could be considered a complicated figure, and one that changed the fate of history forever, even if his family line wouldn't pass further than his own children. Whether he was a psychopath or had some other condition will continue to be debated for years to come. Number 9. According to some psychological research, many of the United States presidents are believed to rank relatively highly in traits associated with psychopaths. Of those, while he may not be ranked the highest, President Andrew Jackson definitely stands out as one of the most disturbing. Jackson was the 7th president of the United States. His time in power was defined by his cruel policies against Native Americans, starting the Trail of Tears that would claim the lives of countless people as they were moved off the lands they had lived on for generations. But it wasn't only his mistreatment of Native American tribes that made Jackson a terrifying and controversial figure. Jackson wasn't born into wealth, but he was sent to school. His mother originally thought he might be a member of the clergy, but he was allegedly too strong-willed and hot-headed for that profession. Those traits would help him as he became an adult, when he studied law and led a militia during the War of 1812. But it was during his time in the military that some of the darker aspects of Jackson's life began to be recorded. Jackson handed out harsh punishments to anyone who he believed had crossed him. This included taking the lives of 6 men of his own militia who wanted to leave. Their terms technically weren't over yet, but everybody except Jackson considered the war to be over already. His famous victory in the Battle of New Orleans came after peace treaties had already been signed. During the First Seminole War, he had 2 British citizens sentenced to capital punishment, carrying out the act the day after they were sentenced to ensure that they could not appeal. Historians today believe any appeal would likely have been successful. War is an extraordinary time, and someone's actions during a war might not necessarily reflect their actions in everyday life. But Jackson was equally violent and quick to anger during peacetime. In 1806, Jackson got into a bitter feud with another horse dealer, Charles Dickinson. The pair traded insults at one another in the papers, with Dickinson accusing him of being a coward and his wife of bigamy. Eventually, Jackson challenged Dickinson to a duel. The pair and their seconds crossed state lines to ensure the duel was legal. Jackson took the time to make sure he was wearing loose clothing, in hopes that it might obscure his frame from Dickinson. That didn't stop Dickinson from striking him, though. Dickinson lodged a bullet close to Jackson's heart. Remarkably, Jackson stayed standing and fired his own weapon at Dickinson. But the weapon misfired, which should have been the end of the duel. According to proper dueling rules, after a competitor fires, he can't fire again, even if he misses or misfires. But Jackson ignored this rule and took aim at Dickinson again. This time, the weapon worked and he struck Dickinson, and the man would pass away a few days later. The duel didn't stop Jackson from becoming president either. He was elected to the White House as a populist. He was especially popular in the South as he backed and forced through policies that would help plantation owners. Jackson himself owned hundreds of slaves as well, but he was also an interstate slave trader. Part of the reason why the Trail of Tears began was that the land that Native Americans had once owned could be used by plantation owners. The Indian Removal Act forcibly removed many tribes from the American Southeast to lands they were unfamiliar with in the West. Officially, Jackson was supposed to negotiate agreements with these tribes, but these were often manipulative or coercive, if they ever even happened at all. The president left a legacy that is still being felt to this day. Number 8. Commodus was one of the strangest and most disturbing people to ever rule Rome. From 180 to 192, he commanded the Roman Empire, although he largely left the ruling to other people, while he performed in gladiator matches and ordered statues of himself as Hercules. Commodus was the only surviving son of Marcus Aurelius, the last of Rome's 5 good emperors. Despite serving as co-emperor with his father for several years, Commodus didn't inherit any of his father's good traits. The early years of his reign were not too bad. He kept many of his father's advisors and ended the war against the Germanic tribes to Rome's north. But after a plot on his life, orchestrated by his own sister, Commodus became paranoid and began behaving erratically. In Rome, any of the senators who had the money or power to overthrow him were taken out. The historian Cassius Dio claimed that his account would become very tedious if he were to name everyone who lost their life in Commodus's purge. He left control of the day-to-day running of the empire in the hands of the commander of the Praetorian Guard. He instead occupied his time with behavior the Senate found strange and scandalous. Commodus believed he was one of the greatest gladiators, and would later claim that he was actually the reincarnation of Hercules, and ordered that the senators address him as such. Commodus would never prove any of these beliefs in any genuine fights. In the Colosseum, Commodus fought against farm animals that had been captured for him, and then fired spears and javelins at wild animals like bears and tigers, but only from a distance. He didn't fight any other gladiators, except in staged events using wooden swords. But he didn't limit his cruelty only to animals. On one occasion, according to the Roman historians, Commodus wanted to reenact Hercules' feat of slaying giants. For some reason, he believed the best people to represent these giants were men who had lost their feet to disease or accidents. The historians claim that objects resembling the bodies of serpents were tied around the men's knees, and they were given sponges to throw at the emperor. He attacked them with a club, and there was little they could do to save their own lives. It was only 12 years into his reign that the people of Rome had decided they'd had enough. A plot developed involving Commodus's own lover after she discovered that she was on his list of enemies. He intended to get rid of her. She worked with Commodus's wrestling partner, who attacked Commodus while he was in the bath. The Senate worked to reverse almost everything he achieved during his reign, including taking down the many statues he had built. Unfortunately, they couldn't return Rome to the good emperors like Commodus's predecessors, and the empire soon fell into a decline. Number 7. Kim Philby was one of the Soviet Union's most successful double agents, infiltrating the United Kingdom's secret services and passing over information for years during the Second World War and the Cold War. Many of the traits that made him a successful spy were also those that made him a psychopath. Philby was born in British India to a diplomat. He studied at prestigious schools in the UK, including Cambridge University. It was while at the university that he made contact with communist sympathizers, including teacher Maurice Dobbs, who established the Communist Party Historians Group. Dobbs helped guide Philby to organizations on the continent that were helping victims of right-wing regimes there. He soon became involved with more radical communists, and in 1934 he was recruited into the Soviet intelligence services. At this point, Philby had no job that would make him an asset as a Soviet spy. Other Soviet double agents already held jobs in the UK intelligence agencies when they were approached by Soviet agents. The only thing Philby had was a background that would enable him to easily blend in with anti-communists. He put that to use when the Spanish Civil War began. Philby traveled to Spain under the guise of a freelance journalist and wrote articles sympathetic to Franco's forces. His goal was to make it seem as if he'd cut ties with his earlier communist leanings, which would ultimately help him infiltrate the organizations that the Soviets most wanted information on. In 1940, Philby was recruited into MI6 with the help of another Soviet agent who was already working at the organization. This was Guy Burgess, another member of the Cambridge Five. This was a group of Soviet spies who'd all studied at Cambridge University, where they were first attracted to the Marxist philosophy. Philby had been involved in recruiting many of the group to the Soviet agency, including Burgess. It was Philby's chameleon-like abilities that helped him rise through the ranks at MI6. According to Philby, his background as the son of a diplomat also helped. The agency couldn't imagine anybody from his class who would think of betraying the UK. It was an oversight that was particularly damaging. During his time as a double agent, Philby stole countless documents related to UK and US espionage activities. Those included details of planned activities to support anti-communists in Albania, Estonia, Georgia, and Armenia. This information cost the lives of thousands of people in those countries, a cost that Philby himself acknowledged, but he showed no remorse for his actions and did not hesitate when he was asked to provide even more information. Philby would later publish a book about his life as a double agent called My Silent War. The book boasted about his achievements and showed he had no sympathy for the people he betrayed, even those that he considered close friends. Number 6. Raphael Trujillo was one of the most disturbing dictators in Latin American history. He was the de facto ruler of the Dominican Republic between 1930 and 1961. During that time, he brutally silenced critics at home and abroad and ordered an attack that claimed the lives of thousands of Haitians. Trujillo rose to power during a military coup in 1930. He'd previously risen through the ranks of the army, having been trained by American forces during the US occupation of the country. After the coup, an election was staged, and Trujillo was handed the presidency. He also had control of the army, making it almost impossible to resist his power. Once in power, Trujillo developed a cult of personality around himself and his family, whom he installed into important government positions. He's remembered today as being a megalomaniac, but also a ruler with a lot of intelligence. Corruption meant that his own wealth was tied to the wealth of his nation. Some supporters have pointed out that the GDP of the country rose significantly during his rule, which may have helped the cult of personality to grow, as ordinary Dominicans benefited. But the dictator also made efforts to aggrandize himself. He renamed the country's capital city after himself, as well as its tallest mountain. Other landmarks and street names were also changed in support of the country's ruler. A popular slogan of the regime was "God in heaven, Trujillo on earth." This was later reversed to put Trujillo ahead of God. Anyone who didn't agree with Trujillo's reign was swiftly eliminated. Thousands of ordinary Dominicans lost their lives at the hands of Trujillo's forces. Even leaving the country didn't guarantee safety. In 1956, a man named Jesus Helindez was kidnapped on the streets of New York City. He was a political writer and had previously tortured Trujillo's son. Exactly why he was targeted by Trujillo's secret police isn't certain, but at least one source suggested he may have written a biography that exposed aspects of Trujillo's life that the dictator didn't want the public to see. Like many of the victims of the secret police, Trujillo's body was never found. His worst atrocities were against Haitians. Even though he himself had Haitian ancestors, Trujillo believed Haitians were detrimental to Dominican culture. In 1936, he ordered a mass attack against Haitians living in the border region between the two countries. According to one myth surrounding that event, suspected Haitians were rounded up in order to say the Spanish word for parsley. As Haiti is a predominantly French and Haitian Creole-speaking country, Haitians would pronounce the word perejil differently from Dominicans. Anybody who used the Haitian pronunciation lost their lives. Number 5. Alcibiades may not be the most well-known historical figure, but some psychologists have used accounts of his life to determine that he had psychopathic traits. Alcibiades was not a character whose life was filled with events that people would typically associate with a psychopath. He was a politician and military leader, but he wasn't known for taking the life of his opponents outside of the battlefield. He also wasn't particularly brutal, but his actions prolonged a war between Sparta and Athens. His motivation was only the humiliation of one of his political rivals. Alcibiades was born in Athens around 450 BC. He was a student and friend of Socrates, who taught him rhetoric, but also hoped to change Alcibiades' vain ways. Years later, when Socrates stood trial, the fact that he had taught Alcibiades was seen as an example of how damaging the philosopher was to society. But during his life, not everyone saw Alcibiades as the scoundrel history would remember him as. Athens was a democracy, and Alcibiades entered the profession at a young age. He was able to win over a lot of his political opponents through charm and the art of rhetoric. This wasn't necessarily for the best for Athens or any ideological reasons. Alcibiades simply wanted to make himself more important. For example, a peace deal had been arranged by other politicians between Athens and the Spartans. Representatives of Sparta came to Athens to sign the deal. Alcibiades convinced them to lie and tell the Athenians that they had limited negotiating privileges. When the Spartans followed through with that plan, Alcibiades revealed this was a lie, sabotaging the peace deal for little other reason than he wasn't the one who had orchestrated it. While Alcibiades' disturbing traits mostly manifested in politics, there were other examples of psychopathy that were more violent. On one occasion, he cut the tail off of his dog for the sole reason of distracting people from the other bad acts that he was committing. A few years after the failed peace negotiation, Alcibiades convinced the Athenian government to send an expedition to Sicily to help a city that had requested aid. On the night before that expedition was set to set sail, a number of Herms, statues dedicated to the god of Hermes, were vandalized. Alcibiades was accused of being one of the people involved, but before a trial could take place, he had to leave on the expedition. While in Sicily, the trial took place in his absence, and Alcibiades was found guilty of the crime and recalled to Greece. Realizing what was going to happen, he fled to Sparta, where he worked as an advisor to the Spartan king. He would later switch sides again, this time to Persia, after a disagreement with the Spartan king. According to some sources, the disagreement was over the fact that Alcibiades seduced the queen. Each time he switched sides, he was able to take on the culture of whatever place he had moved to. Scholars have described his chameleon-like abilities as another example of his psychopathic traits. Number 4. Edward de Vere was one of the most controversial figures in the court of Queen Elizabeth I. While some conspiracy theorists believe he may have actually been the real author behind the works of Shakespeare, looking at his life more closely, it seems more likely that he was actually a psychopath. De Vere was the 17th Earl of Oxford, born into an old noble family. When he was only a child, his father passed away, and he was sent to the home of Queen Elizabeth's principal advisor, William Cecil. A few other orphaned earls were living in Cecil's home at the time, and a few would later rebel against the Queen. Oxford frustrated Elizabeth in other ways. The first sign of trouble for Oxford came when he was just a teenager. He was practicing fencing with another student when he decided he wanted to actually strike someone with the weapon. He chose an undercook who happened to be passing through the yard. The blade hit the cook's thigh, and the cook passed away a few hours later. At an inquest, Cecil tried to manipulate the proceedings to show that Oxford had acted in self-defense, even though the cook, Thomas Bracknell, hadn't attacked de Vere. Instead, the inquest determined that Bracknell had driven himself onto de Vere's blade while he was drunk. Cecil tried to cover up the scandal, and Oxford received no punishment for his actions. As an adult, Oxford wasn't as openly violent, but he did have a gang of retainers, whom he could use to harass those he held grudges against. One of these people was Sir Walter Raleigh. De Vere liked to boast about being in the Queen's favor. It was true that despite causing numerous problems for the crown, de Vere was rarely significantly punished. But it was likely that de Vere claimed he was more important to the Queen than he actually was. According to some sources, he occasionally claimed he was in a relationship with Elizabeth, something that was unlikely to be true. But he also made enemies of any man who was trying to rise in Elizabeth's court, causing problems for them. When Raleigh started to gain the Queen's favor, he sent someone to attack the explorer. Raleigh held off his attackers, thwarting the scheme. Oxford also mistreated his wife, Anne, the daughter of William Cecil. Shortly after she learned she was pregnant for the first time, he traveled to the continent. He was away when she gave birth to his daughter, but when he learned of this, he was angry. He accused Anne of having an affair, even though he knew of the pregnancy before he left. The reason for this accusation didn't seem to be anything Anne herself did. Instead, he was angry at his father-in-law, who he believed hadn't done enough to save his cousin, who was convicted of a Catholic conspiracy. It would be years before Oxford met his daughter. In that time, he'd had an affair with one of the Queen's ladies-in-waiting, getting her pregnant. This was the crime that would put Oxford in the Tower of London, although he was eventually let out on house arrest. His daughter was 5 years old before he moved back in with Anne Cecil. Despite allegedly being involved in Catholic and atheist conspiracies and trying to break his cousin out of prison, Oxford would remain somewhat important in Elizabeth's court until she passed away. He then served her successor, King James, but passed away only a year into his reign. Number 3. Agrippina the Younger was one of the most powerful and influential women in ancient Rome. She was also manipulative, cruel, and showed no remorse for the violent acts she needed to commit to put her son on the throne. Agrippina was the great-granddaughter of Roman Emperor Augustus and the daughter of General Germanicus, one of the most popular figures of the time. Her early life was thrown into turmoil when her father lost his life, possibly in a plot by others seeking power for themselves. Eventually, Agrippina's brother, Caligula, was made emperor. Caligula is known today as one of the worst emperors in Roman history, and may have been a psychopath himself. Agrippina was initially held in high honor by her brother, but was later implicated in a plot to end his life. She was banished, and it was only after another plot against Caligula was successful that she returned to Rome. By this time, she was a widow with a young son. She remarried, but shortly after her new husband made her his heir, he passed away under mysterious circumstances. Many historians believe he was the first victim of Agrippina's ambition. Agrippina has been described as power-hungry, wanting power for herself and her son. There's likely some sexism in the depictions of her, especially in the ancient Roman sources, but also truth in her single-mindedness and ruthlessness. When Emperor Claudius's wife fell from favor, Agrippina positioned herself to take over the role. She was his niece, which should have caused problems under Roman law, but Agrippina and her supporters convinced Claudius to have the law changed. She also allegedly had one of her rivals exiled and later sent people to take her life. According to ancient sources, they brought back her rival's head, and Agrippina examined it, apparently fascinated by her teeth. Agrippina and Claudius were married. She and her son were the last remaining descendants of Augustus, making it a powerful match for the emperor. Once she was at his side, Agrippina started to show a level of power that had never been seen in the wife of an emperor before. She was Rome's first true empress, involving herself in the politics of the day. But Agrippina wanted to secure her hold on power for years to come. Claudius had a son by his first wife, but Agrippina managed to convince him to adopt her son as his heir. Her son was then given the name Nero and arranged to be married to Claudius's daughter. That arrangement also involved manipulation to convince Claudius to get rid of his daughter's current fiancé. Agrippina tried to keep Claudius and his biological son separate, but late in his life, the emperor seemed to make amends with the man who'd been passed up for the throne. According to some sources, he was planning to reinstate his son as his heir when he mysteriously passed away. Number 2. Many historical leaders have been accused of being psychopaths. They're often associated with high levels of violence against innocent people who live under their regime. But for the most part, these individuals aren't taking the lives of their victims personally. Those tasks are handed over to others, who commit what can be described as crimes against humanity on behalf of the ruler. During the reign of Joseph Stalin, the person was Vasily Blokhin. And while many of the people who committed these crimes were affected by the horrors they saw and committed, Blokhin enjoyed his work. Blokhin served in the Russian army during the First World War. After the Russian Revolution, he joined the Communist Party and was soon made a member of the newly formed secret police. His efficiency in his work caught the attention of Stalin. Blokhin was made a member of the elite unit of secret police dedicated to taking the lives of the victims of Stalin's purges. It was a job that Blokhin excelled in. He was quickly promoted through the ranks, becoming a supervisor. Blokhin was now in a position where he only had to personally take the lives of the most high-profile of victims. But that didn't stop Blokhin from doing the work of those he was supervising, ending the lives of ordinary Soviet citizens who found themselves on the wrong side of the regime. Blokhin's most horrifying act came in April of 1940. Months earlier, the Soviet Union and Germany had invaded and partitioned Poland. Thousands of Polish officers, soldiers, and ordinary citizens were taken as prisoners of war. Given Poland's draft laws, this included the majority of Poland's educated class. The Soviet government was especially worried about the officers who were seen as a threat. Officers may have been given the chance to join the Soviet army. If they refused or simply not trusted enough for this, they wouldn't be returned to prison. They would be taken to Blokhin and his men. Blokhin devised a simple, efficient system for taking the lives of the prisoners of war who were sent to him. After verifying a prisoner's identity, they were taken to a special room with a sloping floor for drainage. Blokhin would then use a German-made weapon to take the life of the victim with a single bullet. The body was then removed and the room was prepared for the next victim. The whole process took about 3 minutes. Each night, Blokhin and his men would spend 10 hours going through this process. Many of the bodies were taken to Katyn Forest, where they were buried in mass graves. Some still even had their hands tied. Blokhin would use his own German-made weapon for 2 important reasons. The first was that he didn't trust the Soviet tools would withstand the heavy use he intended to put them under. The second was that if the bodies of his victims were ever found, the crime could be blamed on the German military. By the end of his career, Blokhin is believed to have taken the lives of tens of thousands of people, making him the most prolific executioner in history. Number 1. Ivan the Terrible is one of the most well-known rulers in Russian history. The epithet of terrible might better be translated as terrifying, which hints at some of the behavior that might point to Ivan being a psychopath. Ivan IV became the Grand Prince of Moscow when he was just 3 years old after his father passed away. Despite the awful treatment by his Regency Council, Ivan managed to live into adulthood and took over control of the kingdom at 16. At first, Ivan seemed to be a good and capable ruler. He waged wars of conquest against various people that had been harassing Moscow and other Russian cities for generations. These wars would definitely cost the lives of many people, but it was nothing out of the ordinary for a medieval ruler. There's also no evidence he was particularly cruel to the people he was conquering. Unfortunately for the people of Russia, Ivan's good temperament wouldn't last forever. The Tsar had aspirations westward in a region called Livonia between Russia and Lithuania. Lithuania was supported by Poland and Sweden. The war against them tested Russia's army. In 1558, Ivan's friend Prince Kurbsky defected to the Lithuanians. With his support, the Lithuanians were victorious. The defection significantly impacted Ivan, possibly more than losing the war for territory ever could. Just 2 years later, Ivan's first wife passed away. He suspected she'd been poisoned, an accusation that modern researchers believe might be true. The two incidents made Ivan extremely paranoid and sent him on the path to becoming the terrifying person we know today. After briefly abdicating from power, he was convinced by nobles to come back. In return, he managed to get even more power and turned large parts of his territory into his private land. He built a secret police force to help govern this territory. The secret police committed cruel and violent acts of terror against the people living on the Tsar's land. They would ride around on black horses, carrying the severed heads of dogs as a symbol of their power. Many people lost their lives in extremely disturbing acts of torture. Officially, they were just there to root out the people whom Ivan suspected of betraying him. But Ivan had become extremely paranoid, and even the smallest accusation could lead to an innocent person being punished. On top of this, Ivan gave them the power to control small parts of the territory for themselves, meaning many of the people who were attacked weren't even accused of anything. This was not only violence committed in the Tsar's name. Ivan the Terrible would witness or even take part in many of these acts, and some of his favorite methods of punishing his enemies were impaling or roasting them alive. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.